Okay, so everything is working, seems, I think. And checking the microphone settings. Yeah, microphone, okay. And input, microphone, good. All right, good. Yes, so today is Time to Talk Day, which is a campaign to support removing the taboo about mental health, to ensure that we can talk about mental health as freely as we can talk about bodily health. And in fact, bodily and mental health, of course, go hand in hand. It's no good investing all your time into being fit if there is no investment into also being mentally healthy. And with that, I am just going to check my notes to ensure that I cover all the things that I thought might be worth talking about. And with the first thing, I wanted to cover what mental health actually constitutes. And you'll probably get different answers based on who you're talking to and where you're looking for information. The view that I take is that mental health has to do with everything that constitutes your mental well-being as a person. It includes your self-image. It includes your self-awareness. It includes the way your resilience, how we're coping with stressors in our life, how we're dealing with those, how we're going through everyday life, our perspectives on everything. But of course, it also covers areas such as anxiety and depression. In my view, it also covers neurological conditions, because they can have of course, very fundamental impact on how we're experiencing and how we're seeing the world. And there are, to use the technical or clinical term, conditions like anxiety, well, neurological conditions often have so-called comorbidities, or that then have more acute impact on our well-being. So, for example, a person who is living with an autism spectrum condition is not in a position to easily intuit social constructs or social interactions as easily as a neurotypical person. And because they're, of course, still human, they have a certain requirement for a sense of belonging, and that varies, of course, from person to person. But because sometimes that sense of belonging is not fulfilled, that often ends up in feelings of exclusion, and then other mental conditions can appear, and depression can ensue. And of course, the requirement of a person to then go into a social interaction can then provoke anxiety in the person. So in my view, mental health is a very, very large subject. So over the course of today, I am going to just talk as it comes to me about all of these things that I've just given a very brief overview of. And I'm basically sharing as much as I can remember that comes to mind at a given point in time that I got to learn over the last years of on my journey as a professional coach, and where I've also dedicated a significant amount of time of looking into things like neurodiversity. And also from my own experience, I have been working through periods of depression in my past, and I'm dealing with anxieties every single day myself. So there will be a fair amount of my own experience in there as well. So with that brief introduction out there, I am just going to take a very brief break to share the link of this, just in case somebody wants to tune in. Of course, I will keep this video available on my channel afterwards for people to look at into their own site, their own time. So I am now live for Time to Talk to Me. Here, feel free to join if you can. All right, good. And I'll just put it on LinkedIn as well. See, I don't have a support team for the stream, so I'm just doing these things myself. Good. Okay, good. Cool. Okay, so yes, so mental health is a very big subject, and the first thing I'd like to talk about is, in particular, that we have choices to make about our own mental health every single day. To me, I see mental health really very much like bodily health. So I run a few times every week in order to not only keep my bodily health to a good level, but also my mental health to a good level. The exercise, of course, creates very positive hormones for us that help me to keep the good hormonal level at a good level, and also the time that I spend during my run is good for restorative solitude, if you will. So it helps me to sort through things, process situations, and so on and so forth. And that is an activity that I do primarily for bodily health, but also secondarily for mental health. And when it comes to bodily health, I also look after my nutrition. So I look at what I eat. I ensure that I stay away from processed foods as much as possible. So and why do I do that? Well, because it's very difficult for the body to process processed foods, right? If we stick more to whole foods, then it's much easier for the body to process. If we eat whole foods, then we have better nutrition that comes to the benefit of our body's systems. And the things that we put into our body have a direct impact on how healthy our body is. So when it comes to mental health, I think the same thing is true, and that's of course not just me. That is very well established fact. If we look at one person who consumes all the news that they can out there, and the daily news are filled with everything that's bad in the world, basically, right? It's all very, very negative. And say a person only consumes all these many snippets of bad information. So that of course creates a bad equation in the mind, because the mind is only filled with negative information. So the mind thinks that the world is a terrible, terrible place. So it is then not really a surprise that that these types of people who choose to only pay attention to all the negative things around them are not really of the sunniest disposition themselves, and their outlook on life is also quite negative. So we can make daily choices just as much as we can choose where we spend our money. We can choose what we eat, and choose what we do with our time. We can also choose what information we allow and we invite into our minds. And I think that is a very, very big thing that's worth pointing out for us. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that we should all become hermits and close ourselves also off from the world, and have no and live in complete ignorance as to what's going on out there with the world. But keeping up with current affairs to some point is quite helpful. But instead of, for example, reading a particular newspaper every single day in full, and trying to take in as much of the current events and all the bad things that are happening every single day, would it be sufficient to just consume a 3-minute highlights reel or synopsis of the big events that have happened, or watch a weekly recap, right? And then balance that off with 9 times as much positive information that is coming out there. So the big reason why why bad news is good news for the news outlets, right, is that we're biologically programmed in order to spread, in order to absorb negative news, because that helps us to avoid failure. For us as a species, it's become a much more fruitful survival strategy to avoid failure instead of embracing success. That's just how we're biologically programmed. But realizing that, we can actually use that to our advantage. We can say, yes, I know, my mind wants to learn about all the bad things so that I can avoid them. But the same biological trigger is then abused by the news system in order to provide fodder for this biological programming. And we can say, well, yeah, that is all happening, that is true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I need to consume myself and I need to give away my time to this negativity that is coming in there. So I, for example, I subscribe to the daily summary coming out from the Guardian newspaper in the UK, and that gives me just highlights. And to be honest, sometimes that is depressing enough with all the sometimes stupidly bad things that are happening out there in the world. But it's not in my control, and I cannot do very much about them. Right? There are some things that I can control, and what I can control, I choose to control. But this highlight overview is enough for me. And if there is some headline that actually has something to do with me, so for example, every once in a while there is a reference to the impact of UK's exit from the European Union on EU citizens in the UK. That is something that affects me because I am an EU citizen currently in the UK. So I click the link and I go in there, and because that affects me personally. I personally have no interest in celebrity gossip whatsoever, because these are other people's lives. It's not my life. I have nothing to gain from learning about who had an affair with whom, or who was seen with whom, and doesn't doesn't interest me at all, has no bearing on my life whatsoever. All the bad things that are happening have no bearing on me whatsoever. And when it comes to politics, has very little bearing on me whatsoever, because in the elections that truly make a difference to my life here, I'm not allowed to participate. So what's the point, right? But what I could do is, instead of just simply consuming this one email with all the headlines, I go on to the website or buy the newspaper. I'm a Guardian supporter, but I could go onto the website and consume all the information that is in there, and all the negative news. And Guardian is not really drumming the negativity beat, but they are still a news outlet, so they're reporting on everything that's happening and those things. There are a lot of negative things on there. I'm grateful that the Guardian is doing a great journalism job, as they are, because they also have a lot of great things on the website. So I usually pay more attention to things that are happening in the science area, or climate change awareness, and so on and so forth. But it's the choice is mine, is the moral of the story. I get a headline email snapshot, and that is enough awareness of news for me. I don't need to know anything more than that. So however little of that I consume, what I still balance that with is about 9 times as much useful information that I'm looking to consume. So there is a list of specific websites that I keep up to date with to learn about good things, right? I subscribe to the Harvard Business Review to learn more about how organizations can grow well, about leadership, and so on and so forth. I also subscribe to the New Scientist, right? Those are all more positive things that my mind consumes. And the consumption of negativity is kept and limited to an absolute minimum, because I've made the choice that I don't want to feed my mind negativity. And when it comes to mental health, I think it's very important to make these choices every single day, and allow in only as much of the negativity as is useful, right? And again, I'm not saying that we must be ignorant about the bad things that are happening, but we can choose causes that we care about, and then look for ways to contribute removing them. And where we can do that, we must do that. It's our obligation as being on this planet. We have an obligation to society. We have an obligation to the welfare of the planet. So where we can help, we should help. But consuming negativity doesn't help, right? It doesn't help. The only entities that are being helped by us consuming the negativity of news, for example, are the news outlets. Yeah, and the way that reporting goes nowadays, we must be really careful, right? There are certain broadcasting organizations who have a very specific political affiliation. And when we only follow the news from one of these particular broadcasters, they have a very distorted, or they give us a very distorted view of reality. And when it comes to mental health, we want to ensure that we don't live in a bubble, that our exposure to information is as balanced as possible and as factual as possible. Because if we want to take more control about our mental health and our mental well-being, we want to be mindful what the information is that we allow into our minds. So it's a bit of contemplation around the importance of mental nutrition, if you will, or mental diet. And actually, speaking of mental diet, you could try out putting yourself on a mental diet and actually take stock of what your current mental nutritional profile looks like. What have you been allowing into your mind? What news have you been consuming? What information have you been consuming? And what does that look like? Is the ratio of positivity to negativity one that works for you? Would you like to change something? And if you want to change something, what does your diet program look like? So, for example, if you've noticed that in your audit, in your mental nutrition audit, if you've noticed that you have actually been allowing a lot of negativity in your mind, and you want to see what life is like without that, then set up a diet for yourself and say, well, out of these publications or broadcasting sources, I am reducing myself to this specific one because it has a balanced overview of and as factual as possible overview. And I have noticed in my audits that actually I'm spending, I don't know, 90 minutes a day consuming those types of information sources, and my mental diet is to reduce that to 15 minutes a day, for example, right? And you do that, and you take stock of how your experience of life changes over a 30-day period. Yeah, I would suggest to do it for no less than 21 days. It does take the mind about 21 days to actually internalize a new experience. And therefore, if you do a mental diet, to do that for at least 30 days, so you really can experience the differences, right? So take stock, write down what do you currently, how do you currently feel about the world? How do you feel about your place in the world? How do you feel about how things are going for you in your life? How things are going for you on the planet? And write it down. Do the audit, set up a mental diet for yourself, ensure that your positive stream of information going into your mind is at least 9 times as much as the negativity that you choose to allow into your mind. And after a 30-day period, take stock and see how your rating has changed, and compare that. And then you can make a decision, right? Do you want to go back to what you've done up to 30 days ago, or do you want to stick with what you have, or do you want to tweak it and go forward? So I think this is a very simple thing that we can all do. No one is forcing us to really to consume all this negativity, and we have no obligation to consume it either, right? This is a personal choice that we can make, and we want to be aware of the impact of these choices. And with this little approach of with this little approach of the mental nutrition audit and the mental diet, you can make a very simple change in your life that should really help promoting promoting mental health for you in your life as well. Yeah, so that's one area that I wanted to cover: input and output, diet and nutrition. Good. Okay, so then the next area I wanted to cover is anxiety and depression. So yeah, as I mentioned briefly, I have been through a few periods of depression myself in the past, and I'm working through different levels of anxiety on a pretty much almost daily basis. I have some great days where there is, I would like to think, none. I have many good days where there is very little, and I have a few bad days where there is a lot of anxiety. And so I didn't really understand anxiety very well up until, well, my understanding has been growing over the last few years. Let's put it that way. And that is probably to do with a part of the human condition as people. I think prior to even appreciating how important it is to develop self-awareness, certainly for me, I thought that other people's experience of life was similar or the same as mine. And we were kind of assuming that everyone is processing our experience very similar to how we are processing it. As we then go through the working life, usually we then come about personality assessments and things like that. And that's a good way of starting to appreciate that as human beings, we have a fair amount of commonality, but we're still different to each other in certain ways, and the way that we are, the way that we be, the way that we that we're being, the way that we learn, the way that we interact, and so on and so forth is different. And that learning has grown over time. But my understanding of anxiety really only formed over the last few years, probably. I just thought that was normal. Everyone is experiencing what I'm experiencing, and I didn't really appreciate that there was a need to talk about it. When I grew up, I guess it was already this way, because when I remember when I was asked how I was, my usual response was, "I'm okay." Without really sharing anything further. So that is the core memory, if you will, of that type of inquiry. How are you? I'm okay. And that's, of course, not really very useful, right? Because it didn't that type of inquiry doesn't allow a person to really share what is going on. And that's not because it's expressly forbidden, right? It's I wasn't told how are you, and I'm only asking because I'm expecting you to say I'm okay. That's not what it was. It was a genuine inquiry as to my well-being. How are you? But my response was always I'm okay. So I think that type of pattern has then kind of manifested itself and ingrained itself deeply in my way of being, and has kind of formed the belief that well, I'm okay. That was an accepted response. Ergo, I must be okay at all times. And that in itself is a big is a tall order, right? Because for a human being, having to be okay at all times is impossible, right? We're going through life, we're coping with life, we're dealing with life, we're living our lives. And I of course hasten to add that I am very grateful that I've had a very privileged upbringing. You know, I grew up in Vienna, had nothing to want for, was given everything that was required. I am in a social demographic where I had access to all the opportunity that you could wish for, and I did my best to not ungratefully forego those opportunities, but to embrace them and work out what I can do with them. But still, in my mind, I had the expectation that I have to be okay, and that is quite a stressor, right? So if I'm not okay, then what am I? I'm broken. I'm not okay. So that is probably a big source of anxiety in itself. And then the other thing that's probably worth pointing out, I did learn about a year ago now, almost a year ago now. I started to research neurodiversity, and part of that are autism spectrum conditions. I learned more about that. Part of that, or associated with that, is Asperger syndrome, and based on Asperger syndrome, I came to a self-diagnosis, and with that, I learned more about what that means, and with that, which parts of my being are based on a neurological condition and which parts are not, and so on and so forth. So with all of these things in life, it's never really quite clear cut, and I don't believe that one label is ever the answer to everything, right? So we're just looking for different perspectives that help explain certain profiles, tendencies, and propensities. But with that, of course, I got to learn about why it is often difficult for me to navigate social encounters, and I was always most comfortable in an environment where roles and interactions were more clearly defined and constructed. So I have very fond memories of being with the Boy Scouts. There's a clear code of conduct. There is a very clear set of roles that you can fulfill. There's a very clear pathway and progression way, and that worked very well for me. And of course, the general energy was very welcoming. So I'm very, very grateful to my parents for helping me discover the Boy Scouts and work in there. And even back then, actually, I somewhat naturally took to a leadership position. I was, I don't know what it's called in English, one of six or first of six. So basically, you've got these little small groups of the Cubs, which is a younger form of the Boy Scouts, and they have like little units. And there is one of the Cubs is responsible for the units, and apparently I became one of those quite quickly. Reflecting on that time, it was a lot easier for me to be there and interact there because everything was quite clear. And then I went through the age groups and so on and so forth with the Scouts, and then puberty hit, and I'm not quite sure what was going on then, but it was a very different experience. And going university, I was quite lost because there was other than a timetable for exams and the timetable for classes, I didn't really understand how everything works. And there was I was basically gone from a school where there was a lot of structure, and it was, I've grown up with the structure. So you're part of a class, and you have specific teachers that are with you for a year. Your class is with you for 8 years, and you turn up every weekday in the morning, and you turn up and you do your thing, and that's it, right? And you transition from that into university. Where now? What to do now? And I wasn't really good at asking for help, and the help that was available wasn't obvious to me either. So university didn't work for me very well at all. But then I went into started a student job, and that was really, really good because I applied for a role, I got the role, and it was very clear based on the job description what I was supposed to do. There was a very clear code of conduct again. I was very clear what I was supposed to do, and opportunities became available to me that I embraced. And again, everything was quite clear, right? And all this clarity of roles, expectations, and interactions was really, really helpful. And I didn't really have much of that in the social life, right? And being in a position to navigate a social experience easily and clearly and properly is something that I had to learn through books and so on and so forth, right? And went to dance and etiquette school in order to know how to interact in kind of more formal and so on social environments. But if you imagine that you're unable to intuit how to navigate a social situation, and you have to analyze what's going on, intellectually analyze what's going on, and try to appreciate where everyone is at and how they're interacting, what's going on for them, and doing all of this through actual intellectual analysis, instead of a part of your brain kind of on autopilot in intuiting what's going on. And every social interaction is like that. That is quite a big source of anxiety. And that awareness of this source of anxiety really brought it out for me where that is coming from, right? So if you imagine your mind has the capacity to process a certain amount of things, and for a neurotypical person, you have parts of your brain that are intuitively processing the social interactions. And because that is like a purpose-built processing unit for exactly that, purpose-built processing unit, it's very energy efficient to do that, right? If you imagine you don't have that, imagine you don't have that purpose-built processing unit, then in the rest of your brain somewhere, there needs to be a part that is absorbing all of that information. And there's a lot of information that actually goes into intuitively processing a social interaction, right? Because when you do that, you take in everyone's body language, you take in everyone's facial impressions, you take in everything that they're saying, how they're saying it, what it sounds like. You empathetically take in all the more emotional information and put all of that together. But a part of your brain is doing that purpose-built, automated, super energy efficient. And I, for example, I don't have that ability, and there are quite a few people who don't have that ability. So the rest of their brain needs to dedicate a large chunk in order to process all of that, right? So navigating social interactions for someone who doesn't have the processing unit, and the vast majority of people do have that, right? Neurotypical brains have that, because it's a very old and traditional thing to do for us as human beings. But for someone who doesn't have that, say a huge chunk here has to actively intellectually analyze all of these little factors, make sense of them, and try to work out what's happening next and what's happening next and what's happening next, because you don't really know what's happening next, right? For someone who's intuiting that, you have a sense of what's happening next. And you kind of go with the flow and everything. But for someone who intellectually processes that, there is no going with the flow. Yeah, you process these things, and every single second you're actively intellectually processing. And because of that uncertainty that is inherently there, that causes a fair amount of anxiety. So we need to be aware of that, because it's an anxiety that is, well, as I say this a lot, of course there's not, I cannot think of much anxiety that is really helpful for us. But this anxiety is quite strong, and takes up a lot of energy, right? So if this is the total amount of energy that we have available, and then we're using all of this in order to navigate the social interaction side of things, then whatever is left is what we have available to create and do great things, and help the world, help the people, and do whatever it is that we're doing, pursue creative pursuits, whatever it is. So it's a huge drain of our energies. So we need to be aware of where of the sources of our anxiety, in order to be able to understand where they're coming from, so that we can design our lives around it. And also through the increased awareness around it, we can then work out what we can do to limit and mitigate that, right? Because there are neurological sources of anxiety, such as the one that I just explained, but there are other sources of anxiety which come very much down to our belief systems. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. But I'm going to take a short break now, and I will be back in about 10 minutes or so for the next section where we talk about belief systems and how that influences our anxieties as well. And with that, we're going to go on pause. Thank you very much for now.